of his bathroom, paralyzing his left side and rendering him essentially incompetent. Edith Bowling Wilson, his wife, and Admiral Cary Grayson, his devoted doctor, moved quickly to close the doors and hide his condition from all. But Ike Hoover of the White House staff made this entry in his diary. The president lay stretched out on the large Lincoln bed. He looked as if dead. There was not a sign of life. His face bore a long cut above the temple from which the signs of blood were still evident. He was just gone as far as anyone could judge from the appearances. There followed a strange hiatus in American governance. As biographer August Heckscher has put it, during this period, no proclamations were issued, no pardons granted. Bills became laws without a signature. The regular meetings of cabinet members gave the country the impression that some matters were being dealt with. They sat, these lieutenants who had once gathered around a formidable chief, discussing for the most part trivial matters, and even then were often unable to make decisions. Edith Wilson would sometimes meet with the cabinet and take papers with questions to the president, always behind closed doors, returning with a "he says yes" or a "he says no." Had she read them to him, or had she made up the answers? Nobody knew. Her later defense in keeping all news from the public and barring all but family visitors from the sickbed was that any anxiety might have been fatal to her husband, and her ultimate justification, she would claim, was that he did get better and was eventually able to function more or less like his old self. But it was mostly less. Her excuse that she had no interest in the President of the United States, but only in her husband, was less that of a free American woman than of a Hindu wife who has no obligation to society beyond that of her duty to her lord and master, ending with that of throwing herself on his funeral pyre. Even had there been any validity in her exaggerated fear that any frank revelation of his health might have been fatal to her husband, was the proper governance of her nation not as much worth his dying for as the victory abroad for which he had asked thousands of young men to give their lives? For Grayson, anyway, as a doctor and naval officer, there seems no excuse. The Wilson who at last recovered some of his health was a pale simulacrum of the man he had been. He was querulous, petulant, and unable to take care of his business with anything like the wonderful efficiency that had characterized his former activities. And anticipating the Democratic Convention of 1920 in San Francisco, though he walked with difficulty, supported by an aide and dragging his left leg, and though he could not rise from a chair without assistance, and even though he had once told Grayson that the country was suffering ill effects from his sickness and he should resign his office, he now embarrassed his intimates by insisting that he would seek a third term. Even the loyal Grayson now had to brief Senator Carter Glass on the impossibility of this. His stroke, however, had not been his first. He had suffered one in Princeton in his academic days, and another in Paris during the peace talks, and though in each case his recovery had seemed complete, there is evidence that these strokes took some toll on his temperament. We shall see that there were always two Woodrow Wilsons, and that the tragedy of his bad health understandably contributed to the lesser and not to the greater of the two. This ambivalence in a man so admired confused many who observed him closely. I believe it confused himself. The 28th President of the United States was born a Southerner, but his family had just arrived in the South. His father, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, an Ohio printer turned Presbyterian preacher, was the son of a Scotch-Irish immigrant, and his mother, Jessie Woodrow, had been born in England, the daughter of a minister of the same denomination. Joseph Wilson left Ohio when he accepted a call from the First Presbyterian Church of Staunton.